Has anyone in your house ever poured water at the four corners of the compound on a Friday? Has your mother done it? Your aunt? Your grandmother? Did anyone ever explain why? Solomon did. And he built the reason into the walls of God's house. 3,000 years before your grandmother carried her first bucket to the first corner of a compound in Anambra, or Lagos, or Accra, or Kumasi, and poured without being able to say anything more than, "My mother taught me. Her mother taught her." It is what you do before Friday ends. Tonight I want to show you the architectural blueprint behind that practice, not the folk tradition, the original blueprint. And I want to show you the moment when I finally understood that the text I was photographing in the British Library was a 16th century codification of something that had already been running for 3,000 years through the hands of women who never needed to read it. Let me begin with the structure. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 23. He made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. The Yam Matzak, the molten sea. Solomon's engineers cast an enormous bronze basin, 10 cubits in diameter, 5 cubits deep, holding 2,000 baths of water. Scholars have converted those measurements. We are speaking of approximately 12,000 gallons of purified water. This was not a decorative feature of the temple complex. It was a functional ritual basin. The priests used it to wash before performing the sacred service. 2 Chronicles chapter 4 verse 6 is explicit on this point. It was for the priests to wash in. But here is what most people, even serious readers of 1 Kings, have not fully registered. Verse 24 and 25. And he, below the rim, gourds encircled it, 10 to a cubit. The gourds were cast in 2 rows in one piece with the sea. The sea stood on 12 bulls, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. 12 bronze oxen, 3 facing each compass point. North, south, east, west. This is not decorative symmetry. This is deliberate territorial orientation. Solomon built a water purification system and then placed it on 12 oxen facing the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 corners of the earth in the cosmological vocabulary of the ancient Near East. The molten sea did not face inward, it faced outward, in every direction simultaneously. Solomon encoded the 4 corners principle into the physical architecture of God's house before a single wall was raised around it. The 12 oxen facing 4 directions were not a stylistic choice. They were a territorial statement. This water purifies the space in every direction, to every corner. The house of God is claimed on all 4 sides. But where did Solomon learn this? What was the doctrinal basis behind the 4-directional water system? Numbers chapter 19, the Mei Nida, the waters of separation, the waters of purification. This was the Levitical protocol for cleansing a space contaminated by contact with death. Water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer, prepared according to precise instructions, consecrated, set apart, and then applied throughout the contaminated space. Numbers 19, verse 18. A clean person shall take hyssop, dip it in the water and sprinkle it on the tent, on all the furniture, and on the people who were there, and on anyone who touched a human bone or a grave, or anyone who has been killed, or anyone who has died naturally. The tent, all the furniture, the people who were there. Cover the space with consecrated water, every surface, every corner, every point where contamination could have settled. This was the purification logic Solomon scaled up to a basin the size of a swimming pool, and placed on 12 oxen facing the 4 directions of the earth. The 4 corners water protocol was not Solomon's invention. It was God's protocol, given to Moses in the wilderness, practiced by the Levites for generations. Solomon encoded it into stone and bronze. He made it structural. He built it into the architecture of God's house so that it would not be forgotten, so that the principle would exist in the very geometry of the sacred space, readable by anyone who walked around it and stopped to count the oxen and note which way they faced. 3 north, 3 south, 3 east, 3 west. The instruction is in the structure, for those who know how to read it. And then there is Ezekiel 47. I want to take you there briefly, because this passage is the prophetic extension of everything the molten sea represented. Ezekiel, writing after the temple's destruction, is shown a vision verses 1 through 12. The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. The river flows east, but it also flows outward from the temple in all directions. And wherever the river goes, verse 9 tells us, everything will live. This is the prophetic image of temple water, extending its purifying reach to the four corners of the earth, healing everything it touches, giving life to everything it reaches. Solomon's molten sea on its 12 directional oxen was the architectural anticipation of this vision. Water consecrated in the temple, oriented to every corner, purifying what it reaches, giving life to the space it enters. Your grandmother's bowl of water at the four corners of the compound was not folk medicine. It was this: the river flowing from the temple in every direction, reaching her compound on a Friday evening in whatever city she lived in, giving life to the space it entered. Now the Friday question. Why specifically Friday? Because this is the part that I find almost impossible to attribute to coincidence, and I have spent enough years in enough manuscript archives to have a fairly calibrated sense of what coincidence looks like. 3 traditions, independent of each other, geographically separated by continents, each preserving a different layer of the original understanding, all converging on Friday. The first is the Jewish tradition. Friday is Erev Shabbat, the preparation day before the Sabbath begins at sunset. In the Talmud Tractate Shabbat 35b, the last light before Shabbat is described as the signal to complete the purification of the home. The temple priests cleansed the sacred instruments every week before Shabbat. The domestic parallel to temple cleansing, purify the space before the holy time begins, is structurally encoded in Jewish weekly practice. Prepare the territory before the holy day. Purify before God's time enters. The second tradition is Islamic. Friday, Jumu'ah, is the holiest day of the week in Suleiman's tradition. Surah al-Jumu'ah, chapter 62, describes Friday as the day of divine assembly. In West African Muslim households, ritual cleansing on Friday morning is a documented practice that predates specific Islamic jurisprudence on the matter. Scholars who have worked in the Sahel and along the West African coast trace this Friday cleansing tradition to the same Solomonic heritage that underlies both traditions: the preparation of the space before the sacred time. The third tradition is African Pentecostal. Friday night prayer meeting, Friday evening vigil, Friday deliverance service. If you grew up in a Nigerian or Ghanaian or Kenyan Pentecostal church, if your mother left the house on Friday evening carrying her Bible, if the prayer group gathered specifically before the weekend, you are in this tradition. And the practice of Friday house cleansing, Friday compound preparation with water, Friday spiritual boundary marking before the weekend prayer. This is already common across the Nigerian, Ghanaian, and Kenyan Pentecostal tradition without any institutional source requiring it. It is simply what you do on Friday because it is what you do on Friday. Because 3 traditions preserved the same piece of Solomonic logic through completely separate channels over 3,000 years. You prepare the territory before the holy time. Friday is the preparation day. You clean the house before God comes in. Solomon's priests cleansed the temple instruments before every Shabbat. Grace's grandmother poured water at the 4 corners of the compound before every Friday night prayer meeting. The timing is not coincidence. It is Solomonic precision preserved across 3 continents without a library. There is one more document I want to show you, and this is where the convergence becomes, for me, genuinely difficult to set aside. The Key of Solomon, the Clavicula Salomonis, is a collection of texts that bear Solomon's name and claim to preserve his methods for consecrating spaces and commanding spiritual forces. The manuscripts circulating in medieval Europe are held in libraries across the continent. I have worked with several, including Sloane MS 3091 at the British Library. The scholarly consensus now treats these texts as medieval compilations, drawing on much older material, ultimately rooted in Jewish and early Christian Solomonic traditions from the 1st centuries AD. Key of Solomon, Book 2, Chapter 5. Concerning the bath and the purification of the master of the art, Book 1, Chapter 9. On the construction of the circle for working, place divine names at the 4 cardinal directions. Begin at the east, move to the south, then west, then north. Return to the center to invoke divine authority. Let the master asperse the 4 quarters with holy water, beginning at the east, moving to the south, then west, then north, and returning to the center to invoke the divine name. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Beginning at the east, moving to the south, then west, then north, return to the center, and invoke the divine name. This is the medieval codification of the molten sea's 12 oxen, 3 facing each compass point, beginning with the east, where the day is declared, where the sun rises, where the temple itself faced. The Solomonic tradition explicitly connects purified water with 4 directional territory marking, the declaration of divine authority, and the completion of the sequence at the center. Someone wrote this down in a codex, probably in the 16th century, in a scholarly manuscript that ended up in the British Library, where a researcher named Emeka would eventually photograph it. On a day when he finally understood what his landlady in Stoke Newington had been doing in her garden every Friday morning for 25 years. I need to tell you about Mrs. Adaeze. I was 42, a week before returning to Lagos after a year of archival research in London. I'd been living in a bedsit in Stoke Newington, renting from a woman originally from Anambra State who had been in London for 25 years. A practical, organized woman, a nurse, a church elder, a grandmother who spoke on the phone to her children in Nigeria every Sunday afternoon. Every Friday morning, without exception, she came to the back garden with a bucket of water. It was a small garden, a rental property strip of concrete and tired grass, not much to look at. She moved to each of the 4 corners, 4 deliberate stops, each at a post of the fence, and poured water carefully at each one. Not a dramatic gesture, efficient, purposeful, as if she were completing a task she had done so many times it required no conscious attention. And then she stood in the center of the garden and spoke, in Igbo, too quiet for me to hear through the kitchen window. I watched this for several Fridays without asking. I was deep in the archival work. I was in my head. I filed it as household tradition and thought nothing more of it. When I finally asked, it was a Saturday morning, over tea, the week before I was leaving. She looked at me as if the question was slightly strange. My mother taught me, her mother taught her. It is what you do before Friday ends. No theological explanation, no textual source, no reference to Solomon or to the temple or to the book of Numbers. Just, this is what you do before Friday ends. 6 months later, I was back in London briefly, working at the British Library on a separate research question. I had pulled Sloane MS 3091 for a reference I needed, a 16th century manuscript of the Key of Solomon. I was photographing the pages methodically. I reached the section on consecrating the working space, and I set down the camera. Let the master asperse the 4 quarters with holy water, beginning at the east, moving to the south, then west, then north, and returning to the center to invoke the divine name. Mrs. Adaeze's 4 corners of the garden. Mrs. Adaeze's center pause with words I could not hear. She had never held this manuscript. She had never heard of the Key of Solomon. She had never read about the 12 oxen of the Yam Mutzak in 1 Kings 7. She had never been asked to cross-reference Numbers 19 with 2 Chronicles 4. But she had been performing every Friday morning of her London life, learned from her mother in Anambra, who had learned it from hers, the central spatial ritual preserved in a 16th century Solomonic codex, sitting in a British Library manuscript archive, not because she had read it, because the practice had traveled without the text. Through the hands of women who never needed a library to preserve what Solomon built. Now I want to give you the protocol, because that is what the title promises, and I will give it to you exactly, every step, every source, every declaration. But I want you to understand what you are doing when you do this. You are not performing a folk ritual. You are implementing temple architecture in your household. You are doing what Solomon's priests did every week for the 410 years his temple stood. You are marking the territory before the holy time. Here is how. Step 1. Prepare the water. Fill a bowl or bottle with clean water. Spring water is good. Tap water is sufficient. The molten sea did not require exotic water. It required water consecrated by prayer and divine authority. If you have olive oil, add 1 drop. Then speak aloud, not silently. Exodus 27, verse 20. Command the children of Israel to bring you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, to keep the lamps burning continually. Water and light spoken together. The consecration is complete. Step 2. Begin at the east corner. This is where the temple faced. This is where the day is declared. This is where the 12 oxen began. Stand at the east corner of your house or compound. If you are in an apartment, stand at the east corner of your living space, the corner that faces east. Pour a small amount of water on the ground or on the threshold if you are inside. Speak aloud. You must speak it into the air, not only think it. In the name of the Lord God of armies, what Solomon sealed, I seal. This corner belongs to the Most High. Step 3. Move south. Same action, same declaration. Pour the water. Speak the name. Step 4. Move west. Same action, same declaration. Step 5. Move north. Where the molten seas 3 northern oxen faced. Same action, same declaration. You have now traced the same 4-directional coverage as Solomon's bronze basin. Your house is territorially marked. All 4 corners have been declared. Step 6. Stand at the center. This is the step Mrs. Adaeze was performing when she stood in the middle of that Stoke Newington garden and spoke in Igbo too quietly for me to hear. Speak aloud the dedication prayer of 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 28 and 29. Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence. May your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which you said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place. This is the prayer Solomon spoke when the temple was ready. He had purified the space. He had declared God's presence. He had sealed the territory. And then he stood at the center and invited God in. Speak it when your home is ready. Step 7. Do this every Friday, before sundown, preparing the territory before the holy time. As Solomon's priests cleansed the temple instruments before every Shabbat, as Grace's grandmother poured water before every Friday night prayer meeting, as Mrs. Adaeze poured water in Stoke Newington every Friday morning of her London life. As 3 continents and 3 traditions have been encoding, without coordination, without a shared library, without anyone drawing a line between them, for 3,000 years. Let me close with what the text says. Ezekiel 47, verse 9. Wherever the river flows, everything will live. The river that flows from the temple in 4 directions, giving life to what it reaches, healing what it touches. This is not a metaphor for something that will happen one day. It is the operating principle Solomon built into 12 bronze oxen facing north, south, east, and west. It is what Mrs. Adaeze was enacting every Friday in a garden in Stoke Newington. It is what your grandmother was enacting at the 4 corners of the compound. It is what you're doing this Friday before sundown. When you fill a bowl with water, walk to the east corner of your house, pour, speak the name, walk south, pour, west, north, stand at the center, and speak 1 Kings 8. You have just done what Solomon's priest did every week for 410 years. The territory is marked. The corners belong to God. The river is flowing. Everything it touches will live. Sleep well tonight. Or perhaps don't, now that you know what you're standing in.